Okay, urinary system has these structures here that we'll go into. So the kidneys.
I think there's another PowerPoint for digestive system.
There's two? Hold on one second. Okay, the urinary system, its main function is to help filter out the blood as it goes into the kidneys. So any kind of waste products that occurs in the blood will get filtered through the kidneys, and then whatever we don't need is going to be released as urine. And in the urinary tract, they help transport the urines from the kidneys to the outside of the body. So its function, one, is to store urine so that it allows us to release it when we want to release it. And the process of urinating is called micturition. Of course, we want to release the urine, and the release of the urine is to release the urea, which is these nitrogenous waste from our metabolism. Another is to regulate the amount of blood volume that we have. And when we're talking about the blood volume, remember how we talked about this when we were looking at it in the endocrine system? And how if we end up retaining or having our kidneys retain water or reabsorb water, what's going to happen to the amount of blood volume when we retain water in our kidneys? When we retain water in our kidneys, we're reabsorbing the water to prevent it from being urinated out. Our blood volume will also increase as well, right? If we're urinating it out, and our blood volume therefore will decrease because we're losing water. Does that make sense? Yeah. Because what you'll see how when we reabsorb water, it goes back into our blood. Okay. Of course, if you have high amounts of blood volume, what's going to happen to blood pressure? If you have more blood volume, what's going to happen to blood pressure? It also increases, right? If you have lower blood volume, you're going to have a decrease in blood pressure. Okay, another is to make erythrocytes. What is this process of making erythrocytes called? Erythropoiesis, right? Exactly. And so the kidneys, they make erythropoiesis when it detects that there's not enough blood oxygen. Okay, and once again, erythropoiesis is what is the hormone that is produced by the kidneys to cause erythropoiesis? Erythropoietin, right? So this erythropoietin produced by the kidneys goes to the what makes red blood cells? The red bone marrow, right? So it goes to the red bone marrows to make red blood cells. And it's also an ion and acid balance concentration. So it balances the amount of ions and hydrogen ions, and also some bicarbonate ions as well, but more the hydrogen ions. And basically it helps regulate the amount of these ions. So we could reabsorb some or end up secreting them and releasing it in our urine. There are tissues that are surrounding the kidneys. The kidneys themselves is a retroperitoneal organ. What does retroperitoneal mean again? Behind the peritoneum. Exactly. So on one side of it, it was going to be potentially being covered by the peritoneum, but then the other sides they're not. Okay, so here they have a renal hilum. Where do you think the renal hilum is located at, since we talked about the hilum in other organs before, right? So if you look at the kidneys in that coronal section over there, what kind of, where's the hilum at? Where the blood vessels are going into, right? So over here, this is the hilum. The renal sinuses are these spaces that where you see the blood vessels and nerves and adipose tissue are located at. Okay, so those are the renal sinuses. So when you take a look at the models themselves, the spaces that you see kind of in between the major calyxes and stuff like that are going to be the renal sinuses. There are surrounding tissues too. The one that surrounds the kidney itself is called the fibrous capsule, made up of dense, irregular connective tissue, and it's for protection of it. There's a perirenal fat layer. The perirenal fat layer is the fat that surrounds the kidneys. So this fat that surrounds the kidneys here is called the perirenal fat. Helps cushion and insulates the kidneys. We have the renal fascia, which is around that perirenal fat here. Also made of dense, irregular connective tissue. And helps supports the kidneys. And then there's something called a pararenal fat. And this is the fat that surrounds the renal fascia. Okay, so we have directly surrounding the kidneys themselves is once again the fibrous capsule. Okay, around that is the fat layer called the perirenal fat. Okay, and around the perirenal fat we have the renal fascia. Okay, and then around that we have the pararenal fat. Okay. So I think this one we're going to be basically getting these terms from this picture here from your textbook. I think it's just a diagram only one. Okay, so when we're looking at the kidneys, it's subdivided into these renal lobules here. Here are the renal lobules. The outer portion of it is called the renal cortex. So this is just the renal cortex over here. On the renal cortex, they do kind of go into the medulla area, and these are called the columns, and we'll talk about that in just a second. But of course the inner part is going to be called the medulla. Yeah, we always have a cortex, and then medulla is the inner part. Once again, we have the renal columns. The renal columns separates each lobule, renal lobule, their extension of the cortex. And within the medulla part, we have these renal pyramids here. So this is the renal pyramid. Since it's a pyramid shape, they have a base and also a papilla over here, which is the apex of the renal pyramid. And these will contain a lot of these tubules that will allow the filtrate becoming urine to go out into these structures called the minor calyx. These are minor calyx. And when the minor calyces fuse together, they'll become a major calyx. So these are major calyces. And when you have multiple major calyces fusing together, now you have the renal pelvis. And from the renal pelvis, it will become the ureter. So the kidneys, they need blood too, right? So we already know about the renal artery and renal vein. Okay, so blood is carried to the kidney through the renal artery. From the renal artery, it starts to divide. So each time you see it dividing, it becomes a different blood vessel here. So let me use a different color here. So the first division here is going to be called the segmental arteries. These segmental arteries will branch into the interlobar arteries. So it goes to each lobe. Okay, so now we have the interlobar arteries. And then from the interlobar arteries, notice how it kind of curves over here? And this curving forms this arc called the arcuate arteries. So remember how we learned about the arcuate artery when we were talking about on the foot? Same aspect in this case scenario. So at the arc area, it's called the arcuate arteries. These are called the interlobar arteries. So from the arcuate arteries, now we have these very smaller blood vessels called the interlobular arteries. Just be careful with the terms, right? There's the interlobar arteries. Now we're at the interlobular arteries. And from the interlobular arteries, now we go into more of the microscopic aspects of it. So we have the arcuate artery over here. Here's the interlobular arteries. And coming off of the interlobular arteries, we have a afferent arteriole. Afferent, once again, bringing blood to that structure right there. And that's glomerulus, which is a capillary bed over here. And this is where blood is going to be filtered in the kidneys. Okay, so from the afferent arteriole over here, it goes into glomerulus. And once it gets into glomerulus, it goes through this blood vessel here. What do you think that blood vessel is going to be called? Now it's going out of the glomerulus. The efferent arteriole. So it comes out of the efferent arteriole. And from the efferent arteriole, depending on the type of capillary beds that we're talking about, there's two different capillary beds. But this capillary bed is for the gas exchange for the kidneys themselves, and also for nutrient and waste exchange as well. And anything that's getting reabsorbed from the kidneys is going to be reabsorbed here. Remember how we were talking about so reabsorption of the water or on the ions and stuff from the kidney? This is where it's going to go into the blood system. Okay, so one of two areas. One is the peritubular capillaries. These are the peritubular capillaries. They are usually in the cortex and associated with the convoluted tubules. The convoluted tubules we'll talk in just a second, so don't worry about that term for right now. And then there's something called the vasa recta. And the vasa recta, you can see, is deeper, right, into the kidney. So this is found in the medulla of the kidneys. And this is morely associated with the nephron loops. The nephron loops is another term that we'll just talk about in just a second. The nephron loops of the juxtamedullary nephrons. We'll talk about that term too. Just a second. Okay, so that's the vasa recta or the peritubular capillary. Okay, so now that we're from the capillaries, now we could now go into the venules, right? The veins, right? So we have the interlobular veins. The interlobular veins will go into, what do you think this vein is going to be called? The arcuate vein. So the arcuate veins, right? Interlobular veins into arcuate veins. Okay. And from the arcuate veins, what do you think that these veins are going to be called? The interlobar veins. Very good. And the thing that differs between the veins and the arteries is over here. Remember how we talked about the renal artery becoming the segmental arteries here? The veins, on the other sense, doesn't have a segmental vein. It goes straight into the renal vein itself. So it's missing that segmental vein. It just goes into the renal vein. And once again, the right and left renal veins, they go into the inferior vena cava back to the heart. The uniniferous tubules consist of all these structures, and these are the structures we're going to be going into next. First is the nephron itself. This is the functional unit of the kidney. And when we talk about the nephron, it consists of all these parts here. We have the renal corpuscle. The renal corpuscle consists of the glomerulus, which we just talked about. What was the glomerulus again? It's a capillary bed, right? That helps. What's its function? Filters the blood, right? And then around that is a glomerular capsule. So together you have the corpuscle here. And then you have the different renal tubules that we'll talk about. There's two types of nephrons. There's the cortical nephrons and the juxtamedullary nephrons. Most of the nephrons are the cortical nephrons. The cortical nephrons have most of it staying in the cortex. And then the juxtamedullary nephrons, these are the nephrons that will actually go with the nephron loops going into the medulla. So when you take a look at this figure over here, you have this nephron here, and you have this nephron here. Okay, so comparing the two here, what do you call this nephron over here? Versus this nephron here. I'll redraw it real quick. So you have this nephron here versus this one here. Yeah, the right one is a cortical nephron. The left one, notice how the nephron loop here goes pretty deep here. This is called the juxtamedullary nephron. Okay. You'll notice that you still have all the different parts here. The renal corpuscle is located here. The proximal convoluted tubule is located here. The distal convoluted tubule is located here. Same thing as the cortical nephron. You have the glomerular capsule with the glomerulus, the proximal convoluted tubule, distal convoluted tubule, all located here. So majority of it is still going to be in the same area. Okay. However, if you look at the nephron loop for the juxtamedullary nephron goes pretty deep into the medulla, while the nephron loop of the cortical nephron just slightly dips into the medulla. So over here, this is a kidney themselves, and we've looked at this a few times before. So here is the renal corpuscles here. Okay, you notice how there's kind of a division around here. Okay, so this is part of the renal cortex. This is the renal medulla on the right hand side. So when we look at the corpuscles, once again, the corpuscles consist of two parts, right? One is the glomerulus itself, right? The capillary bed. And number two, it's the renal capsule, okay? So we have the glomerulus, and this is a fenestrated capillary. Do you guys remember what was fenestrated capillaries again? They have small pores around it, okay? So it allows that's why it allows the blood to be able to be filtered through it. Around the glomerulus, we have the glomerular capsule, also known as the Bowman's capsule, okay? So you have the glomerulus inside and the Bowman's capsule outside, or the glomerular capsule on the outside. The glomerular capsule has a visceral layer. The visceral layer actually surrounds the glomerulus. So here's the glomerular capsule here. It has the cells that surround the glomerulus, and these cells are called podocytes. And you notice how this is a podocyte over here. So that's actually part of the glomerular capsule, the visceral layer of the glomerular capsule. The podocytes have these little feet called pedicels, which are these structures here that come off of the podocyte. All these structures that you see here are the pedicels. In between the pedicels are these filtration slits. So anywhere you see in between the pedicels here, I'll call it filtration slits. These filtration slits allow the blood to go through it. However, it prevents certain blood plasma proteins from getting filtered through. Okay. There is also a slit membrane, and this is a combination of the filtration slits of the podocytes that we just talked about here, and also the fenestrated glomerulus, And that's combined, both of them together, is called the filtration membrane. This space that you see over here, this is called the capillary space. And this is where the filtrate from the blood goes to. So you have blood coming into the glomerulus. What is that vessel again when blood goes to glomerulus again? Afferent arteriole. It goes into the glomerulus. Once it goes to the glomerulus, it goes through the fenestrated capillaries, through the filtration slits, and from the filtration slits, now instead of blood that coming through it is called a filtrate. Okay, so it's not called blood anymore, it's called filtrate at this point. The parietal layer of the glomerular capsule surrounds the glomerular capsule, surrounds the glomerulus here. And remember how we talked about what was the tissue that we see over here? Do you guys remember the tissue? What type of tissue is this? That back in Unit 1 we looked at it. Simple squamous epithelium. Simple squamous epithelium. Very good. And here's a look at it again. So let's just take a look again. So collectively, this is a renal corpuscle. Renal corpuscle. Good. This structure here in the inside here is called the glomerulus, right? Glomerulus. Good. And then when we talk about this specific part of the glomerular capsule is the not the visceral, but the parietal layer of the glomerulus. This space that you see here, this is called the capillary space. Capillary space. Okay. You don't actually see the podocytes and stuff. I mean, you do see it. It's so confusing because you can't tell if this glomerulus, since it has the podocytes on top of the glomerulus itself, you won't be able to distinguish these two. So we're probably going to be looking at some of the diagrams, and there's some models that actually shows you the pedicels, the filtration slits, the podocytes themselves. So look at the model. There is a model that actually shows you this. Okay, now that we have the filtrate. Okay, the filtrate is located first at the capsular space, okay, of the renal corpuscle, right? And so we have the filtrate going from there to the proximal convoluted tubule. The proximal convoluted tubule is made up of simple cuboidal epithelium. It has a lot of microvilli. The microvilli is to increase the surface area, okay? And once again, the increase in surface area in this case scenario is for reabsorption of these ions and certain nutrients, okay? Mostly ions and water that we're going to be talking about here. Okay, the reason why I brought this figure up is because you'll later learn of another convoluted tubule called the distal convoluted tubule. So you have the proximal convoluted tubule and the distal convoluted tubule. So how do you know which is which again? The proximal convoluted tubule has the microvilli, and the microvilli, if you look at it, are these structures that you see here, the fuzziness that you see in here. So if you see that it's kind of fuzzy, you know it's proximal convoluted tubule. While if you look at these structures here, they don't have any fuzziness inside their lumen over here. So this is going to be a distal convoluted tubule. So that's how you're going to distinguish the two. Okay, so from the renal capsule, right, to the proximal convoluted tubule. From the convoluted tubule, now we're going into the nephron loop. The first part of the nephron loop is the descending limb. The descending limb goes down into the medulla here. They have two parts to it. They have a thick portion of it and a thin portion of it. The thick portion is made of a simple cuboidal epithelium, and then if you look at it over here, it becomes thin. So the deeper that it goes into the medulla, it becomes thin. And this is mainly to reabsorb water. And then what do you call this next part, you think? Ascending limb of the nephron loop. This ascending limb goes back to the cortex. So it starts off with a thin layer here and becomes thick. Okay, the thin, once again, simple squamous epithelium, thick, the simple cuboidal. And its main function is to reabsorb ions as it goes up. Okay, so just think about it. This is more physiology, but just think about it. Okay, we have the filtrate, right? It filtered some ions and stuff in the proximal convoluted tubule, filtered some water as well. As it's going down, what is it doing? What's its function? The descending limb of the nephron loop? To reabsorb water. Okay, if it's reabsorbing water, the filtrate, is it becoming more concentrated or less concentrated or the same concentration? It's going to be more concentrated. Does that make sense? Because it's reabsorbing water. If it's reabsorbing water, it's taking water out of the filtrate into the capillaries that's surrounding this, right? Depending on the capillaries that we were talking about, right? What was the capillaries that go into deep into the medulla called again? Oh, okay. This is the nephron is called the juxtamedullary nephron, but what do you call the blood vessels surrounding? No. Okay, the fenestrated capillaries, they're of the glomerulus itself. Okay, this is a different type of capillaries. It starts with a V. Vasa recta. This is the capillary bed that's around the nephron loops of the juxtamedullary nephrons. Okay, and then you have capillary beds over here around the convoluted tubules. Those are called well, it's next to the tubules, right? So starts with a P. No, there's a capillary beds around this area. Tubular capillaries. Okay, I'm just talking about the reabsorption of these ions and water and so on and so forth. Okay. So once again, as you're going down the descending limb, since you're reabsorbing water, you're reabsorbing it from the filtrate into the blood. Okay, so the filtrate, if it's reabsorbing water, right, the filtrate itself becomes more and more concentrated. Does that make sense? Okay. Here's the filtrate. Okay, this is the descending limb of the nephron loop. And just say this is a blood vessel here, okay? So water is being reabsorbed, so the concentration gets more and more concentrated in the filtrate. Does that make sense? Okay, ascending limb. We said, what's its main function? To reabsorb ions, okay? Okay, so if you're reabsorbing ions, what's happening to the concentration of the filtrate? So now we're going to ascending limb here for ascending. And just say this is the nephron loop here. So ascending limb, the blood vessels next to it. Now we're ions, just say sodium ions, just say, okay, are getting reabsorbed into the blood vessels here. So what's going to happen with the concentration of the filtrate? It's going to decrease because the ions are being pulled out at this point. Does that make sense? Concentration of solutes. Yeah, just concentration of any of the ions. Just say concentration of these ions.
So it's a little like washing machine. So it's like pulling water out, now we're putting water in, but it's just like the volume of the liquid will shrink. But then the point is like the concentration of it will be like concentrated enough so concentrated enough.
Yeah, a little bit like that. And there's a reasoning behind this. You'll learn that in physiology, but I just want you to kind of understand what's going on, kind of thing. So from the ascending limb of the nephron loop, now we go into the distal convoluted tubule. The distal convoluted tubule secretes potassium ion and hydrogen ions, but it reabsorbs sodium ion and water. And we talked about this earlier on, about ADH, aldosterone, and stuff like that, right? ADH is antidiuretic hormone. What does it do again? Reabsorbs water. Okay, good. Aldosterone, on the other hand, what does it reabsorb again? Sodium ions. If it reabsorbs sodium ions, what's going to follow? Water is going to follow. So in some essence, water reabsorption as well. So it does affect the distal convoluted tubule to cause reabsorption of waters and solutes. Okay, once again, there's not as much microvilli in the distal convoluted tubule. So therefore, if you look at, say, this one, these are all distal convoluted tubules, right? While these ones are what? Proximal convoluted tubule. Okay, so now that we're going from the distal convoluted tubule, we're going now into the collecting ducts. At this point in time, the collecting ducts, it's going to be coming urine at this point, okay? So the collecting tubules are these tubules that go into the collecting duct. Here's the collecting duct here, and the collecting tubules are these things that come off or branches off or branches into the collecting duct, okay? So you have multiple nephrons here. Here's another nephron, just say, and then its collecting tubule is located here. So here's like the renal corpuscle, proximal convoluted tubule, descending and ascending limb of the nephron loop, distal convoluted tubule. Here is the collecting tubule, and it's going into the collecting duct. ADH and aldosterone also affects this area here in the collecting ducts. And then when we get into the collecting duct, now we are going into the papillary ducts here. The papillary ducts is at the papilla of the, what do you call this again? The structure here, when we look at the, where are these structures here? Yeah, very good. The renal pyramids, right? Renal pyramids over here is the base, right? And what was the peak over here? It's not the. It is the apex of the pyramid, but we have a different name. It's not called the apex, but the. No, it's called the papilla. This is the papilla here. Hence the reason why we have papillary ducts at this point here. The papillary ducts are just at the very ends of the collecting duct here. So papillary ducts, they will end up releasing the urine into these structures here. What are these structures? No, the renal sinuses are in between these structures. Minor calyx. Yeah, minor calyx. This is the minor calyx. When you have the minor calyx fusing together to become major calyx. So here is a major calyx here. Here's a major calyx here. And when the major calyx fuse together, they form the renal pelvis. Renal pelvis. Okay, and from the renal pelvis, now we could exit the kidney into the ureters. There is something called juxtaglomerular apparatus of the kidney. And it helps regulate the amount of blood pressure that affects the glomerular filtration. So the JG cells are just called the juxtaglomerular cells. And like the name implies, it's right next to the glomerulus. And these are actually modified smooth muscles of the afferent arteriole. So these are located on the afferent arteriole. Okay, so these are the juxtaglomerular cells here. They release this paracrine called renin when the blood pressure is low. So when blood pressure is low, how do we want to try to increase blood pressure? We already talked about this before, right? What's one way of increasing the blood pressure? Adding blood volume, right? Kind of thing. That's one way of doing it. Okay, how potentially can we increase blood volume? By causing more water reabsorption, correct? So what happens is that this renin is going to cause an increase in aldosterone. What does aldosterone do again? It increases reabsorption of sodium. Where again? In the kidneys. Specifically where on the kidneys? The distal convoluted tubule and mostly in the distal convoluted tubule, but also a little bit on the collecting ducts as well. Okay, and when you reabsorb sodium, what's going to follow? Water is going to follow, and that's going to help you increase your blood pressure. Okay, so that's one way. It detects whether or not the blood pressure is high or low. The macula densa are the cells within the distal convoluted tubule next to the glomerulus here. Okay, so here's the glomerulus, right? So this macula densa is located in the distal convoluted tubule, Here are these specialized cells here called the macula densa. It detects the amount of ion concentration of the filtrate. So it helps regulate the amount of filtrate that's going to go into the glomerulus by regulating the ion concentration of the filtrate. So it ends up releasing some paracrines to the juxtaglomerulus cells. So if you think about it, right, if it becomes really highly concentrated ions and the macula densa ends up detecting that, right? So here, the distal convoluted tubule, it detects really high concentration. It's going to release some paracrines to the juxtaglomerular cell. So what is it going to do then? It's going to end up causing the vasoconstriction or vasodilation at this point. Do we want to have more filtrate or less filtrate? Yeah, So, since the filtrate itself is very, we're just saying scenario-wise, if it's very concentrated, right? If it's very concentrated, we want to have more reabsorption of water, right? Kind of thing, right? Because it's the filtrate is too concentrated of solutes at this point. So we want to have more retention of water, right? So do we want more water, more blood flowing through and making more filtrate, or less filtrate at this point? Less. We want to retain more water, right? So it will vasoconstrict the afferent arteriole. Versus if it detects that the filtrate is too low in concentration, right? If it's too low in concentration, then we want to release more water out, right? And so it will end up vasodilating the afferent arteriole. Those concepts don't worry about too much. It'll reoccur once again in physiology. But just know that the macula densa, it regulates by detecting the amount of ion concentration here, and it regulates the juxtaglomerular cells, which are the afferent arterial cells here. Okay, the ureters themselves. Oh, did we see a histology slide for that? Oh yeah. Okay, so here's the histology slide here. We have, what is this again? This entire thing collectively is called the renal corpuscle. Very good. And this renal corpuscle, if you look at it, this thing in the middle here is the glomerulus, right? The glomerulus, notice what is, let's just say, what is the structure here? What are these structures? Proximal convoluted tubules. Very good. How about this structure over here? Distal convoluted tubule. Very good. And you notice how this distal convoluted tubule is right next to the glomerulus here, right? Right next to the renal corpuscle here. And you'll notice how these cells that are even closer to it is a little bit different from the other cells that you see over here. So here you have the macula densa here. You guys see that? Okay, so now that we're done with the filtrate, and it's now urine, right? The urine, we already said, passed through the collecting tubules to the collecting duct. From the collecting duct, it goes through the papillary duct, right? Papillary duct, then to the minor calyx to the major calyx to the renal pelvis, and now we're in the ureter. From the ureters, it'll just travel from the kidneys to the urinary bladder. Okay, there's different layers of it. There's the mucosa layer, which is made up of transitional epithelium. Do you guys remember transitional epithelium? Back in Unit 1? So why is it called transitional? Because it could change its shape, depending on whether or not if it's filled or distended or not. If it's filled with urine, then it's going to distend and become flattened out. If it's not, it becomes kind of rounder in shape. And it's impermeable to urine. Okay. Underneath it is the lamina propria, made of dense irregular connective tissue. And you'll notice that around that even is this muscularis externa over here. Okay. And it undergoes peristalsis to allow the urine to be passing through it. The interesting thing about this muscularis externa here is that it has an inner longitudinal layer and an outer circular layer. So it's kind of reversed compared to the digestive tract, right? The digestive tract, we said that they have an inner circular layer and outer longitudinal layer. Okay, so it's reversed in the ureters here. And you notice how around this you have adventitia. And you can see once again this is adventitia because serosa, if it was serosa, it would be only one single layer that surrounds it, right? But you notice how there's so much connective tissue around the ureter here. Made of areolar connective tissue. Now we go into your urinary bladder, right? From the ureter, it goes into your urinary bladder. This is where it stores the urine. It's a retroperitoneal organ, meaning that it is behind the peritoneum. Very good. It has an area called the trigone. And this is between the urethral openings and the ureter openings. Okay, so the urethral opening and the ureter opening. And it acts as a funnel. Let me see if I have a picture here that shows it to you. Yes, over here. So here's the ureter openings here. Here's the urethral opening. So this is a triangle shape. This is called the trigone. There's also a median umbilical ligament that comes off of it. This median umbilical ligament is a remnant of the embryonic urachus. Okay, the urachus comes off of the urinary bladder and goes to the umbilical cord area. Okay, for the urine waste that the fetus has. It has multiple layers too. It has a mucosa layer here. The mucosa layer contains rugae. What else had rugae? Do you guys remember that term? The stomach. And once again, it allows for distension, right? Same thing as the stomach, right? It's able to distend, right? So what do you think this epithelium is again? Transitional. It's still transitional. Underneath it, you have the lamina propria here. So here we have the mucosa layer here. Submucosa layer is underneath that mucosa layer, made up of dense irregular connective tissue. And then when we have to look at the muscularis layer, the muscularis layer has 3 layers. This muscularis layer is the detrusor muscle itself. Okay, so it has a special name for this. It's called the detrusor muscle. It has 3 layers to it. And one of those layers, it contains the internal urethral sphincter. And this is, since it's a smooth muscle, so this is an involuntary controlled muscle here. And it acts the same way as the anal sphincter acts when we talk about the internal anal sphincter. So meaning that it's usually contracted until it gets filled up. In this case, it's filled up with urine. When it's filled up with urine, it starts to relax. And when it starts to relax, that's where we start to have this urge to urinate, micturate, right? And we have the external urethral sphincters to prevent us from urinating. until we want to go. And then around all that is the adventitia, which you don't really see on this particular picture because we have to go deeper down. Okay, except for the very top side. The top side is covered with peritoneum, so it has serosa on the top side. Okay, it makes sense because this is a retroperitoneal organ, right? So the top side has the peritoneum and it's behind it, and adventitia on all the other sides. They have a urogenital diaphragm. The urogenital diaphragm is this bottom part here with the external urethral sphincters on either side of the urethra here. And this is voluntary skeletal muscle. So from the urinary bladder, now we go into the urethra. And the urethra just basically transport urine from the urinary bladder to the outside environment. They have different layers. Once again, you have a mucosa layer. And depending on the gender or the sex of the person, they have different epithelium. For females, it just tends to be just one type of epithelium. For the males, they have a few different types of epitheliums. And we'll talk about those when we get into the reproductive system, so don't worry about it for now. And then the muscularis helps move the urine to the environment. And we have around that the adventitia again. Female urethra tends to be rather short, made of a stratified squamous epithelium because of how close to it outside it is. And once again, the urethra has 3 different regions to it, and we will talk about that once again in the reproductive system. Actually, I guess we talk about it now. I thought we were talking about it in the reproductive system. Okay, so there's 3 regions of the male urethra. We have the prostatic urethra, and like the name implies, this is going to be within the prostate. It goes between the prostate gland. Okay, it's made up of transitional epithelium, which makes sense because we're coming from the urinary bladder. And what kind of epithelium does the urinary bladder have? Transitional epithelium. Okay, so it's kind of like a continuation of that. The membranous urethra located here. What do you call this structure over here again? That surrounds the urethra on either side? The external urethral sphincter directly around it. And what do you call the external urethral sphincter being part of? The urogenital diaphragm. So the membranous urethra is within the urogenital diaphragm over here. And then you have, the epithelium is, it could be either stratified columnar or pseudostratified columnar at this point. And then you have the spongy urethra. The spongy urethra is the longest portion, located in the corpus spongiosum. We'll talk about this in the reproductive chapter. We'll talk about that in the reproductive chapters anyways. But it's made up of pseudostratified columnar epithelium on the proximal side, so closer to here is pseudostratified columnar. But as it goes towards the distal end, then it becomes the stratified squamous epithelium. And then you have the external urethral orifices. So the external urethral orifice is where the exit of the urethra. And you notice how as it gets closer and closer to the outside, it becomes stratified squamous epithelium. It's just that, the potential of, once again, to protect the urethra from the outside environment. Okay, so this is more of kind of to test you or to review what we just learned. Okay, so the pathway of the filtrate in urine, once again, it starts in the where does the filtrates form? Where is filtrate formed? Yeah, the glomerulus capsule, right? Or within the renal corpuscle, right? Okay, how is filtrate formed again? From the glomerulus, right? As the glomerulus, it filtrates the blood by pushing the blood out, right? Through to the glomerulus capsule, right? So the blood, as it's being pushed out, it goes through the fenestrated glomerulus through the filtration slits, right, of the visceral layer or the pedicels between the pedicels of the podocytes, the visceral layer of the glomerular capsule. So as it's pushing it out, now we're in the, what do you call that space? Capsular space, okay? So the filtrate starts in the capsular space, right? Okay. And at the capsular space, what will it go to next? What is the next path it will go to? So here's the capsular space, right? What do you call this first part here? Proximal convoluted tubules. Okay, very good. From the proximal convoluted tubule, it will go to where next? Descending limb of the nephron loop. Okay, so this is proximal convoluted tubule to the descending limb of the nephron loop. Very good. And then, what do you call this next part? Ascending limb of the nephron loop. Okay, good. To the, what do you call this part? Distal convoluted tubule. Distal convoluted tubule. And then we said that it'll enter through these structures here on either side. What do you call those? These structures here on either side. Collecting tubules. Collecting tubules into, you have multiple collecting tubules going into the collecting duct. And then at the very ends of here are called the papillary ducts. Okay. From the papillary ducts, now we go into the minor calyx. Very good. Minor calyxes. The minor calyxes, they will end up forming the major calyxes. And so we have the minor and then the majors, right? Majors form the renal pelvis. And then renal pelvis will go through the ureter. The ureter will go into the ureters go to the, no, not yet. Ureter is this, right? It'll go into, what is this organ here? Urinary bladder. Okay. The urinary bladder has an internal urethral sphincters that will go through, right, into the, what's next? Urinary bladder, how does it go out? Urethra, okay. If we're talking about male, it will first go through the prostatic urethra, good. Then through the membranous urethra, and finally the spongy urethra. Okay, good. Okay. And remember how the membranous urethra has the external urethral sphincter? And the spongy urethra at the very end goes out of the external urethral orifice. Good. Okay, so that's the pathway of the filtrate, right? How about the pathway? Okay. Well, you have to know the pathway of how blood goes into kidneys and stuff too, right? So do you guys want to go over that as well, or do you guys? Okay. So I think I actually went over it, but let's go over it again. It's all the way over here. Okay. So we have blood going into the renal arteries and becomes segmental arteries, good, to the interlobar arteries, good. From the interlobar arteries, what do you call this part where arcs like this? Arcuate artery, very good. From the arcuate arteries, here's the arcuate arteries, it comes off of it. What do you call these? Interlobular arteries, and goes to the glomerulus. What do you call this as it going to the glomerulus? Afferent arterial. Okay, now we're in the glomerulus. From the glomerulus, it comes out of it, called the efferent arterial. And depending on where we're located at, okay, if it's a cortical nephron, what do you call this capillary bed here? Peritubular capillaries, right? But if it's a juxtaglomerular nephron, vasa recta, okay. From that, now we go back into this, what do you call this vein here? Interlobular vein to the arcuate vein. From the arcuate vein, we have interlobar vein, very good. If I could bring it out. Interlobar veins. From the interlobar veins, you go to the renal vein. Okay, they don't have a segmental part. Okay, good. All right. That's it for this chapter.